Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of our Climate Reality. It is a pleasure, as always, to be here to share with you information as it pertains to climate change and its impacts. This evening, we will be looking at the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, and don't worry, you'll get to know what that means in just a moment. We have two very special guests with us, Dr. Adele Thomas, and she is an author of the IPCC report, and also Mrs. Aria St. Louis, and she's with the Ministry of Climate Resilience, and she's also Grenada's representative at the IPCC. We have a lot to discuss, and this evening we hope to share with you, of course, what we mean when we say IPCC. Of course, you'd learn that. Some of the findings from the assessment report, the trends, the impacts, the solutions, implications for Grenada and the Caribbean, among other things. We'll be taking a short break in just a moment, and when we come back, we will be introducing our guests to you. More than a century of burning fossil fuels, as well as unequal and unsustainable energy and land use, has led to global warming of 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This has resulted in more frequent and more intense extreme weather events that have caused increasingly dangerous impacts on nature and people in every region of the world. There are multiple feasible and effective options to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to human-caused climate change, and they are available now. Now, that's according to scientists in the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report released on March 20th, 2023. According to IPCC Chair Ho Sung Lee, mainstreaming effective and equitable climate action will not only reduce losses and damages for nature and the people, it will also provide wider benefits. This synthesis report underscores the urgency of taking more ambitious action and shows that if we act now, we can still secure a livable, sustainable future for all. We'll be back with you in just a moment. Stay with us.
Home is easy as 1, 2, 3.
Thinking about your new home? Think easy. Think a Republic Bank Home Easy Loan. Think affordable. Think convenience. Think Republic.
Home is easy as 1, 2, 3. Republic makes home easy.
Wow, that was such a breeze.
Own your home with ease.
So whether laying that first brick or purchasing an existing home, we've got you covered. Republic Bank will get you those keys hassle-free in no time.
Home is easy as 1, 2, 3.
Apply for a Home Easy Loan today for a chance to win a cash prize. Getting your new home is easy with Republic Bank.
Republic Bank, we're the one for you.
Terms and conditions apply.
Our environment is our responsibility. Budget Marine contributes by selling environmentally friendly products. For example, we sell lightweight open boats that require a relatively small engine. Best to combine with our Tohatsu 4-stroke engines. They use little fuel and have a low emission. Carib Marine solar panels are specially made to withstand the Caribbean climate. The panels are suitable for use at home and on the boat. The required chargers and converters are also available from Budget Marine. Keeping your car and boat clean extends the lifespan, but residues of the cleaning products disappear in nature. We at Budget Marine sell eco-friendly cleaning products from EcoWorks, not harmful to nature and also clean very well. Plastic junk in our oceans is a major problem. Fortunately, there are companies that clean up and reuse the plastic into usable products. Marlowe, manufacturer of lines and ropes, produces docking lines made out of plastic waste. Another company is Sperry Shoes. Sperry has a collection made from used fabrics and plastic waste. Just a few examples of how we at Budget Marine contribute to help protecting our environment. We care.
Solar Vision is the champion. We're lighting up the whole Caribbean. Solar Vision is the champion. We lighting the whole Caribbean. The ultimate solution to get rid of pollution. We're going green to be healthy. Going prosperity, going green. For prosperity, going green. With solar vision, we going green.
Available at Grenada Trade Center, Montrouge, St. George. For more information, call 444-5291 or 404-9012.
It's the 4th edition of Hubbard's Live Free for 1 year promotion. Cuatro Punto Cero. It's unbelievably amazing. You can win free fuel, free drinks, cash prizes, free property and vehicular insurance, free cable, TV and internet, free electricity, free coke, free water, free cooking gas, free paint supplies, free passes to Sunshine Promotion events for 2023, free groceries, all for 1 whole year. And every winner receives a lunch package. Be sure to fill out the entry forms and enter it into the marked entry boxes at all Hubbard's departments and at participating outlets. Promotion runs from April 1st to September 30th, 2023. Draws will be held every 2 weeks. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome back, everyone, and for those of you who just joined us, we welcome you. Of course, we welcome our viewers on GBN Television, our friends on our Facebook page and YouTube channel, and our listeners on K105 FM. I did mention that our 2 guests this evening, Dr. Adele Thomas and Mrs. Aria St. Louis, and I'll ask them now to take a minute just to share with us a little bit about themselves and what they do. And we'll start with Dr. Thomas. Dr. Thomas?
Yes, good evening, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm Dr. Adele Thomas. I am a senior research associate at the University of the Bahamas. I am a Bahamian. And I'm also a senior research associate with Climate Analytics, which is a think tank based out of Berlin, Germany. I am an author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. I've been an author on this report as well as the 5th assessment report, which came out in 2012. So I have over 15 years of experience doing climate change research, focusing particularly on small islands such as Grenada. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. Mr. St. Louis, tell us a little bit about you and what you do. I think you're still muted.
Sorry. Yes, so thank you so very much. Like Dr. Thomas, I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Aria St. Louis. I'm head of the Environment Division and come from a background of molecular biology. I've spent a number of years working at the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources in their DNA Profiling Center. Before working, I was cross-appointed to Fisheries and to Wildlife Division at the University of Florida, and then returned back to Grenada in 2010, where I became the climate change focal point for a number of years. And then subsequently, once the Environment Division had grown and hired someone, I moved into the position of technical CBD, that's the biodiversity focal point. I was introduced to IPCC through the former IPCC focal point, who is Mr. Michael Mason. And I'm really delighted to be here talking a little bit about the recent AR6, the Assessment Report 6. I think the final thing I should say, I think most people would know already, is that in 1991, I was lucky enough to win the Miss Grenada competition. Yes, and then indeed. In 1996, they brought back all the former Miss Grenadas, and I was a winner again and attended the 1996 Miss World competition. So Grenada participated and ended in the top 50 as a result of that.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm going to stay with you because we're getting right into our discussion right now. We're talking about the IPCC. So, Ms. St. Louis, tell us about the IPCC. Explain to our viewers what it is and, you know, the work, what do they do?
So I would say very quickly, the IPCC is really the science policy interface. And it's so important to us as governments because it bridges the gap between what's happening as credible science and how that can inform policy. So IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it has a membership of governments. Most of them belong to the UNFCCC, and it's oftentimes either the World Meteorology Center sends their representatives because the focal points for climate change sometimes come from the meteorology world, or else through the United Nations Environment Program, the UNEP focal points or the climate change focal points attend the IPCC meeting. So it's really a meeting of members who come from governments, and it is to look at and assess credible science. So I would say to all science teachers who are bewildered by the amount of information that is online, that if you are looking for credible science, it is to the IPCC reports that you should be looking. The IPCC itself does not produce primary data, but looks through thousands and thousands of publications and then pulls together with levels of confidence key scientific information. I think there are three main working groups. Working Group 1 that deals with the physical science, Working Group 2 that deals with the adaptation, and Working Group 3 that deals with mitigation measures. And again, each one of these large working groups will be looking at all the published literature for the last 4 to 5 years. And IPCC is tasked with the responsibility to produce key documents that feed back into the Conference of Parties and are considered at the COP meetings. So every 4 years, which is the typical cycle, what will happen is you have the production of these working group reports. And for this recent cycle, which produced the AR6, we had 3 additional special reports. And those were particularly important to us because we had called for these reports since even Grenada was chairing AOSIS in 2008, 2009, 2010. The 1.5 special report, the cryosphere report, which is also the report about the melting ice sheets, and the land report were 3 additional special reports, in addition to the working group reports that were produced. So in a nutshell, again, these function as credible scientific background upon which our policymakers make decisions.
Right, thanks. Now, we hear a lot about the reports, and, you know, they're coming together. But why are all these reports relevant? What's the purpose of it?
Well, I think I want to say that when I first started, you are bombarded when you go online by the amount of information about the science of climate change, the credibility of climate change. And as a result, I think that the IPCC has taken the time, and they actually were formed since 1988. So even before we formally had the crystallization of the 3 big Rio conventions, there was already the recognition that there was a need for credible science as a platform to guide policy. And I want to use the opportunity here too to say that we have many in academia who perhaps need to think about crossing over and playing a role in policy development and sort of unpacking what the science means to help inform good quality policy decisions. And our policymakers are not necessarily well steeped in the science, and so it becomes really important to make sure that that's palatable for them. This report, again, pulls together, so I should say the IPCC pulls together all the current publications. And in fact, between the assessment report for the 5th assessment report and this assessment report, we saw quite an increase in the number of publications that could be used to help us understand what would be the implications for staying below 1.5 degrees C threshold, for example. And this is something that was called upon by small island developing states because we are at the front line of the battle. Unfortunately, our emissions are very low, but disproportionately, we find that we are the ones whose loss of lives through flooding, through loss of lives, through hurricane, through storm surge, are disproportionately larger. So again, having credible sources of information that we can use and draw upon in order to make strong justification globally to access means of implementation, access to resources, including financial resources, become very important. So I expect that AR6 and the synthesis report, or the assessment report 6, and the synthesis report and summary for policymakers forms a very strong basis for small island developing states as they move forward in their discussions and negotiations with other countries on means of implementation.
Thank you very much. Dr. Thomas, is there anything you would like to add to what Mrs. St. Louis just said?
Yeah, that was an excellent overview of the IPCC. There's so much that goes into them, but I just want to additionally highlight that the IPCC reviews thousands of different studies and assesses them to produce these crystallized reports that really show what the latest science is telling us. And so if you go online and you just, look up some climate change study, that's just one study. The IPCC synthesizes all of them and says, this is the current state of science, and this is what we know. And just additionally, these reports are agreed upon by all of the member governments. And so you can't have a government then come behind and say, we don't believe in climate change because you have agreed to this report. So it really strengthens that scientific backing of policy measures. So, yeah.
Right, and I'm staying with you, don't go anywhere. You mentioned in your brief introduction that you were one of the authors, this last report and a previous one. How does one become an author of the IPCC?
It is quite an arduous process becoming an IPCC author. So you have to be nominated by a country to be an author. In order to even be nominated, you need to be an established researcher or practitioner in your field. So having a history of publications, having a history of being involved in climate change research and the science. The IPCC receives thousands of nominations of scientists and researchers, and they then select from these nominations the select few that will actually be authors. They try to maintain a balance of different genders, and they try to maintain a balance between people from the developed world and the developing world. And I want to highlight that being an IPCC author is a voluntary position. So we're not paid for doing this work. It's something that you sign up for because it's such an important report. And it also, brings you closer to other scientists that are in the field.
Okay, wonderful. Now, clearly, from what you said and what Mrs. St. Louis said earlier, these reports are of critical importance. Mrs. St. Louis highlighted the importance of credibility, and this is where people should look to in terms of getting information that they can really use. So what's the process involved in preparing, reports like these that are so critical and important?
Yeah, it's quite a lengthy process. They take years to actually be developed. So the 6th assessment cycle, which is what we're reading the synthesis report for now, actually started back in 2017. So it starts then with the governments, the member governments themselves come up with an outline of what they want the reports to say. So they say, these are important topics. We want the scientists to go and tell us what the latest scientific literature is telling us about these topics. Then the author teams are selected. Those authors use that outline. They develop a first draft of the report. That first draft is open for expert commentary. So other experts from around the world that are not IPCC authors look at that first draft and they provide their comments. We get thousands of comments, as you can imagine. We then take those comments, we produce a second draft. This is reviewed by all of the government members of the IPCC, and they submit their comments. Again, thousands of comments go in. We produce a third draft. And this is also reviewed by governments, and it leads into the development of a final draft, which is then agreed on by the member governments. So it's quite a long process. We review thousands of different scientific studies and reports. We're working with people from all around the world. So like I would be up on a 5 a.m. call, working with people that are in Asia, trying to figure out how we're going to synthesize all of this information into a readable format. And as Mrs. St. Louis said, we don't conduct original research. We look at existing research and really assess and synthesize it. So it really is a long and in-depth process in producing these reports to ensure that they are as policy relevant as possible and as accurate as possible by having other experts and government members review them.
Right, and the process clearly is lengthy in putting these reports together. How large is this report? If you mentioned putting it in a readable form. Now, if I have to pull one of these reports and I decide I want to read, how long would I have to read? 2 days, 3 days, a week, a month?
You'll be reading for months. So the reports are thousands of pages. But what is most helpful are the summary for policymakers. So for the summary for policymakers, we distill what's in that 1,000-page report down into about 20, 30 pages that really gets to the gist of what it is that we're trying to convey, and then point you to where you can get further information in the longer report.
Okay, wonderful. Well, that's very reassuring. Mr. St. Louis, anything you'd like to add in here?
No, I think Dr. Thomas has covered it excellently. Yes, you asked some wonderful questions, and I think she's really given the kind of insight into the hard work that's involved in each one of the steps to maintain a transparent process, make sure that it's fair, and without being policy prescriptive, provide the key responses that the COP has asked for.
Right. So one more question to you, Ms. St. Louis, before we go to the break. Now, you are a government representative, and you will have to review these reports. Of course, what is involved in performing these tasks? And share with us some of your experiences.
Oh, well, I think Dr. Thomas has hit the nail on the head that way. I mean, from our perspective, it starts with the mandate that comes from the parties. And I say parties because I'm thinking about the Conference of Parties context. But usually, having had good caucus and discussion, we know where the guidance is needed and where we have gaps in our knowledge and understanding, which will inform how decisions are made by the Conference of Parties. And that feeds into the IPCC right at the beginning, as alluded to by Dr. Thomas. I joined at the midway. So I was giving support to the former IPCC focal point, who is Mr. Mason from Land Use, and I became his alternate. And so together, we read through the 1.5 special report, which was about 17 or 18 chapters. And this was, hundreds of pages that we divided up between us. And then we would meet like every 2 weeks, discuss what we thought were the most important points. And I think for the first time, Grenada actually submitted comments that went into one of the rounds of iterations that Dr. Thomas has spoken about. But it was a proud moment for us to hit send, because even how you document your comments was a very robust process, and one that I benefited from learning about, because we're now using this, for example, with our National Ecosystem Assessment, which is another large document, again, on the biodiversity side, but again, requiring the kind of robust review and feedback from both technical editors and those who have experience on the ground, so from community. And it requires the kind of rigorous documentation that we got through looking at the IPCC process and learning from it. So it really helped me as a learning experience. It's a huge amount to read through, and I actually had to really be disciplined about sticking to my own schedule to get through some of these key reports and make sure that we submitted at least some comments on specific chapters that were particularly relevant for us. And of course, the most recent meeting and preparation for that was hair raising. Again, because as alluded to by Dr. Thomas, what happens is in 30 pages, you get a huge competition to see whose key points can best be positioned into that 30 pages. And when you think that each of the working groups has produced about, on average, 15 chapters, trying to get the highlights into 30 pages is quite a journey in and of itself. So I do recall having many interesting sessions. And then when I took over as focal point, continuing that and trying to make sure that we got in some feedback. And then COVID made things even more interesting. So I'm sure that Dr. Thomas has interesting stories because, again, when you get together online, and much of the preparation for this 6th assessment cycle has happened online. So when you are talking with people, I think she mentioned people who are in Asia, they're 12 to 14 hours ahead. So that means that if you really want to speak with them, you got to speak with them at 8 or 9 o'clock at night our time, which is 8 or 9 o'clock their time, or even earlier. So you're talking about 10 or 11 p.m. at night, starting a 2 or 3 hour conversation with them. So it really was quite a testament that I think the authors worked together and produced these key documents, but never more needed than now. This is a really critical time for us. And, therefore, I really felt like if, as indicated, it was a labor of love, certainly a labor, but a labor of love because I think we really crystallized key lines that can be used by our policymakers to make firm and important decisions. And this document, I think now, the synthesis report and the summary for policymakers within that will be an important and well-referenced document over the next 4 years to unlock access to key resources. And I really think that, I have to thank persons like Dr. Thomas. Again, she's clearly indicated that this is something done voluntarily, and it's a huge investment, huge, above and beyond what your normal job, your normal task, your normal work would be. I think it's almost like having triplets or producing another PhD because of the workload that's involved. You have to do it well beyond what is reasonable, what is normal, and what is expected. But the dividends are high and the stakes are even higher.
Dr. Thomas, I'm listening to you both, and with the volume of work that is involved. What if there is an alleged error? How is it dealt with?
Yeah, so this is why there are so many rounds of revisions, and each comment that is submitted by all of the governments, by all of the expert reviewers, as the IPCC authors, we have to go through and respond and show how we addressed each comment. So you have thousands of eyes on this document, and multiple rounds of revision. And so that catches any errors that will be in there. And I mean, the review comments are so thorough. They're like, I read this paper that you're referencing and this number is incorrect. And so you have to go back and check and double check. And then, there are multiple checks and balances to make sure that there aren't any errors in the final report.
Okay, wonderful.
And if you don't mind, just to build upon what Dr. Thomas has said, I wanted to highlight that there are some really new, novel ways in which key information is expressed. There are some figures that we've never seen before. So I don't want you to feel like if this is all just cut and paste from documents. No way. It really is a synthesis, which means it's been taken apart, chewed, put back together in a format that's palatable for us. And when I say us, I mean those within government who may not be as strong in the science, and ultimately our policy makers and our decision makers, because they are the ones who really will steer the ship. And then we will, as government officers, implement what things they have asked to be done. But it's really, so that summary for policymakers is really important. And contrary to what I may have shared before, certainly, and Dr. Thomas has highlighted this, it is that there are novel and unique ways that they have expressed things, particularly with the figures, that I found so very helpful and so very useful in the summary for policymakers, in the synthesis report, and in the underlying technical chapters that have been prepared. So it's not just a cut and paste from whatever is out there.
Thank you very much. When we come back from the break, folks, we will be looking at the main findings of the 6th assessment report. Stay with us. We'll be back with you in just a moment.
Home is easy as 1, 2, 3.
Thinking about your new home? Think easy. Think a Republic Bank Home Easy Loan. Think affordable. Think convenience. Think Republic.
Home is easy as 1, 2, 3. Republic makes home easy.
Wow, that was such a breeze.
Own your home with ease.
So whether laying that first brick or purchasing an existing home, we've got you covered. Republic Bank will get you those keys hassle-free in no time.
Home is easy as 1, 2, 3.
Apply for a Home Easy Loan today for a chance to win a cash prize. Getting your new home is easy with Republic Bank.
Republic Bank, we're the one for you.
Terms and conditions apply.
Our environment is our responsibility. Budget Marine contributes by selling environmentally friendly products. For example, we sell lightweight open boats that require a relatively small engine. Best to combine with our Tohatsu 4-stroke engines. They use little fuel and have a low emission. Carib Marine solar panels are specially made to withstand the Caribbean climate. The panels are suitable for use at home and on the boat. The required chargers and converters are also available from Budget Marine. Keeping your car and boat clean extends the lifespan. But residues of the cleaning products disappear in nature. We at Budget Marine sell eco-friendly cleaning products from EcoWorks, not harmful to nature and also clean very well. Plastic junk in our oceans is a major problem. Fortunately, there are companies that clean up and reuse the plastic into usable products. Marlowe, manufacturer of lines and ropes, produces docking lines made out of plastic waste. Another company is Sperry Shoes. Sperry has a collection made from used fabrics and plastic waste. Just a few examples of how we at Budget Marine contribute to help protecting our environment. We care.
From the farm to the store to your home. Supporting farmers, catering for your needs. The Food Fair Supermarket provides fresh fruits and vegetables from its 2 convenient locations for over 5 decades. The Food Fair Supermarkets, where you can fill your baskets without emptying your pockets.
Solar Vision is the champion. We're lighting up the old Caribbean. Solar Vision is the champion. We lighting the old Caribbean. The ultimate solution to get rid of pollution. We going green to be healthy. We going green for security. We going green for prosperity. Going green with Solar Vision. We going green.
Available at Grenada Trade Center, Montrouge, St. George. For more information, call 444-5291 or 404-9012.
Welcome back, everyone. It's our climate reality, and this evening we're looking at the IPCC report. This segment, we want to look at the findings of the 6th assessment. And Dr. Thomas, we will start with you. Let's talk about the main findings of the report, starting with the trends.
Yeah. So with this 6th assessment report, the science is very clear that human activities have caused global warming and that we have a global surface temperature increase of 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. So it's very clear that we are burning fossil fuels, we are causing global warming, and this in turn is causing physical changes to the environments that we are already seeing. Some of the physical changes that we can already attribute with a lot of confidence to human-induced climate change are increased extreme weather events, such as heat waves, such as heavy rainfall, such as droughts and tropical cyclones or hurricanes, as we call them in the region. We're seeing upper ocean acidification, so our oceans are becoming more acidic. We're seeing global sea levels are continuing to rise and are actually rising at faster rates. We're seeing glaciers are retreating due to hotter ocean temperatures. And one thing that's pretty novel in this assessment report is that we have increased evidence that there are compound extreme events happening. And so a compound extreme event is when there are two or more extreme events that happen at the same time. So, for example, a heat wave and a drought happening at the same time. And as you can imagine, this makes the impacts from those events much worse. During a heat wave, you require more water, but if you have drought at the same time, then you have less water that's available. So the impacts become much worse. And so in terms of trends, the trends are showing negatively that we are affecting the physical environment, and these trends are going to become more pronounced and more extreme with every increment of warming. And again, we're at 1.1 degrees now. Every increment over that means that the trends will continue to get worse.
Okay, and you want to just go a little bit more in detail on the impacts as cited in the report?
Yes, so we know what the changes are to the physical environment, and this in turn has impacts across the globe on people, on nature, on animals. So we're seeing already widespread and devastating impacts around the globe. I remember when I first started with climate change research, we thought we wouldn't see impacts until the year 2100, but we have increasing evidence that we are already experiencing these impacts now. Now we have millions of people that are exposed to food insecurity and reduced water security. And we find that this is most prevalent in the developing world and also for people and households that are low income. Between 2010 and 2020, we've seen human mortality from floods, droughts, and storms has been 15 times higher in highly vulnerable regions, such as in small islands, compared to other regions. What we've tried to pull out in this report are some of the impacts that aren't really talked about, such as mental health challenges that are associated with increasing temperatures. We're seeing trauma that people are experiencing from extreme events. So you could imagine going through a hurricane and losing everything that causes trauma and mental health issues. And we pulled out in the report that that is attributable to climate change. We're seeing climate and weather extreme events are increasingly driving displacement, so causing people to be moved from their homes. We're seeing ocean warming and ocean acidification has already affected fisheries, which is important for us here in the region. And more globally, half of the world's population currently experiences severe water scarcity due to climate change. So the impacts that we're seeing are quite broad, experienced around the world, but are really felt more intensely by people in vulnerable countries, such as small islands.
Right. And does the report recommend any solutions to these challenges that are before us?
Yes. So the report, we tried to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And what that means is we're not saying what policymakers should do, but we're trying to provide information that may be helpful for policymakers to use. One of our key findings as it relates to solutions is that what we are doing now is not enough. And we really need to ramp up our efforts if we want to cap the existing trends in climate hazards and the impacts that we are already seeing. The first thing that we need to do is really to cut greenhouse gas emissions very quickly and very sharply. So greenhouse gas emissions need to be cut by about half by the year 2030, which is, in less than 7 years from now. There are tried and tested options that are available to help us to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. So things like solar energy, wind energy, energy efficiency technologies, these are all viable. And in fact, the costs of these technologies have reduced over the years, which makes them even more attractive to use in order to reduce our greenhouse gases. Another thing that we could do is to increase the uptake of things like electric vehicles, which then drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions that come from the transportation industry. Secondly, we need to increase our adaptation efforts. So the things that we're doing to protect from those climate impacts. Not enough attention is paid to adaptation, and current adaptation efforts are really not extensive enough to protect us from the impacts that we are experiencing now. And they are most definitely inadequate for the risks that we will face in the future as these climate impacts intensify. And then the final thing that I just want to highlights as a solution to the climate change challenge is that there is a need for political commitment to address climate change. You know, I've been involved in climate change research for a number of years. The science keeps getting better and better. We report with more and more confidence the direction that we're going into. But without that political commitment to do something about it, then unfortunately the trends, the negative trends will continue. So that political commitment to spur the action that is needed in order to combat climate change is critical.
Thank you very much. Mrs. St. Louis, anything you would like to add here? I think you're muted again.
Sorry.
That's all right.
I'm excited. I think that she's covered it excellently, but I just want to use the opportunity to make a plug for research. I think what we are seeing now is that, particularly for small island developing states, we have a young cohort of scientists, sharp, brilliant minds, who are very interested in following up because this is the planet they will be inheriting. And in that context, good quality research that's making its way now into publications becomes really key. I think even before, the story that we're able to tell as a result of the recent assessment report and that cycle comes from recognizing that for our region, we needed plenty more publications. So I do want to make a plug here to say that research is essential. If we want to talk about what's happening to us locally, nobody else is going to tell that story but us, and we can tell it best. So therefore, credible, good quality primary data collection on what's happening in the context of adaptation and how we are using biodiversity as a relatively inexpensive way to support both carbon capture and storage, as well as mitigating wave energy and other ways that we want to adapt, becomes really important for us to document and utilize and publish so that these can form part of a credible record of what is happening and then be utilized by climate scientists like Dr. Adele.
Yeah. Quickly, Mrs. St. Louis, Dr. Thomas mentioned a very important area there, the political commitment from our leaders. How can we get our political leaders to understand the importance and also the seriousness of what we're facing? How can we get them to understand the need to commit to seriously addressing this issue?
Well, you know, I would say that they're already looking at this again because since the Rio conventions, since Rio +20, what was recognized is that the models in the past that looked only at economics were not accounting for what was happening environmentally and what was happening socially. What's been recognized now with the coining even of the term, we moved from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we know that climate resilient pathways, and that's what they are discussing now, are the only way for us to proceed. You know, so I feel like if certainly it's now come front and center for us. And what has been said in this assessment report and in the summary for policymakers is that this is a critical decade for action. Yes, we continue to raise awareness, but now we unequivocally not only know what the science is saying, but that we have solutions available. And all this, Dr. Adele has said, it makes me smile because I say, the climate scientists, I really give my hat off to, because they keep on working hard, they keep on knocking at the door, even when things are so clear. But I believe that our policymakers are very much on board and aware. What we need now is the uptake at the grassroots level, at the local community level. And in Grenada, I can only speak for Grenada, but I would imagine from the Bahamas, go right down through to Suriname, there has been an awakening of the fact that climate change is real. And it is actually happening now. And the unpacking of what those impacts are for someone who lives in Vendam, what the impacts are for someone who lives in Soubise on the coastline, what the impacts are for someone who lives in a small sister island or lives in Eleuthera or lives in Spanish Wells, becomes really unpacked and understood by them in order to promote resilient action. So I think that's where the groundswell needs to happen, because these are difficult choices, but choices that we have to make every day. It's not just about renewable energy, it's about energy efficiency. It's about deciding to use less water when you shower. It's about traveling with a friend in their vehicle instead of enjoying your favorite music in your vehicle. So these are small incremental changes that have to be made by people. These are decisions that have to be made. And this is why I think that they speak about it being climate change being a global problem, but with local impacts. We're now unpacking how to address those local impacts, and people are starting to understand how their small actions, one family nearby me collects, they go out on Saturdays and they'll pick up garbage all over the place, particularly the plastics. Why? Because having had discussions, they're really aware that plastics that remain in the marine environment can contribute to greenhouse gases. And so they feel that every single one that they pull is actually not just creating a healthier ocean, and the oceans are really central to managing our climate, it's also directly reducing one possible contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. That's the kind of action. But instead of it being fragmented, what we need now are those watershed moments when they're coming together of multiple communities, all doing actions, all planting back. So we see the carbon capture and storage happening from replanting of new plants. So I think that's the kind of action that we need to see. And voters are very powerful. If they lobby and speak with their MPs, MPs listen.
Yes, they do. They do. Dr. Thomas, I want to come to you now. Let's explore some of the findings, as related to small island states like Grenada and St. Vincent. So, what does the report, contain in this respect?
Yeah, the report has lots of relevant information on, the hazards, the impacts, what we can do to adapt. But what I really want to highlight is that the report has key information on 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so the slogan for us in the Caribbean has really been 1.5 to stay alive. And that means that we need to keep the global temperature increase to no higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, we are already at 1.1 degrees Celsius, and we are currently on track for global warming to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius during this century. And actually, current international commitments to deal with climate change put us on track for global warming of 2.8 degrees Celsius, so well above that 1.5 that we need to stay alive. The projections of climate hazards above 1.5 degrees are particularly troubling for island nations such as Grenada. We're going to see sea levels that continue to rise over long time frames. So in a few hundred years, we could see multi-meter sea level rise, which would completely eradicate our islands. Before that, we will see increases in the intensity of hurricanes, of droughts, of heat waves. We'll see increasing ocean acidification that affects fisheries and our coastal protection from storms. And all of these different hazards, present challenges for industries that we rely on: farming, tourism, fisheries. So the report really is a red flag for small islands like Grenada that we are not on the right track and that our very existence is at risk. And this is the most evidence that we've had to date, and the most clear messages that the IPCC is delivering is that small islands and other vulnerable nations are really at risk of not being around in the future.
Right, definitely. And some of the Pacific Islands there, I was doing some reading, and there's some countries little islands that are almost on the verge of, islands like Kiribati, and so they're almost on the verge of going under. So it is serious. Ms. St. Louis, what is Grenada doing in response to these ever-increasing threats from climate change?
Well, I would have to say that we are caucusing well. Mm-hmm. We are participating so that we can be heard regionally and internationally at various fora. And I want to highlight here that this particular assessment report, so the summary for policymakers, is really a friend to us because it highlights some of the key enablers like access to finance, like technology, like international cooperation, that become really important in the small island developing states' battle to try to remain viable. I think that this document shows clearly that where we need the support, because there is enough finance available, but it's not being directed appropriately, is support with respect to creating that enabling environment and supporting the implementation actions. So in Grenada, I think that we have done quite a bit with respect to adaptation, both when you think about from the policy framework, which is necessary for action and which is spoken about in the AR6, because they speak about clearly the need for the political commitment, and that's translated, of course, into policies and key legislation that must be implemented. So we have things like our National Adaptation Plan with a costing, and that adaptation plan took 2 years of consultation because we looked with those on the ground to see how will you be impacted? And therefore, what kinds of actions do you think will help to promote resilience in your communities? If you are in Levra and you depend upon ecotourism, and you know that with a warming and more acidic ocean, you are going to have some issues with the turtles that are coming in. You are likely to face sea level rise, as Dr. Thomas has alluded to. How are you managing? What are you thinking about in terms of diversifying your options? If you are a farmer along the coastline who's already experiencing saltwater intrusion, and we've had the reports on this, where people along the coastline as farmers have dug and collected fresh water so that they're not actually getting water from our National Water and Sewage Authority, which is treated water, but they are now seeing that saltwater is coming up and into their stored water. How are they thinking about managing this? And in the longer term, what kinds of crops are they thinking about that are going to be drought tolerant, flood tolerant, et cetera, et cetera. So those discussions and the actions have started on adaptation. And Grenada has submitted both our intended nationally determined contributions or which became our first nationally determined contributions. And then with the kind support of climate analytics, where Dr. Thomas gives support, we also have updated our nationally determined contributions in compliance with the Paris Agreement. We were one of the first to submit our updated NDCs, where we are looking at transitioning our electricity sector. And people know that the monopoly has now been broken, that now your sources of energy can come from multiple sources, including renewable energy options. And that's separate to the management of the grid. And that allows us to explore wind, to explore solar. And these are important technologies that have been shown to have good penetration in our islands. So there's a lot that people as individuals, as households, and as businesses, because it makes sense economically to do this, have started to undertake both with respect to adaptation action as well as mitigation action. And then finally, I want to identify that because finance and access to climate finance is a key enabler, we have lobbied hard for capacity to be built both within government as well as community for how to access climate finance. Again, the context is that it's not necessarily for the island to wait on the government to identify and do the actions, but proactively, communities can come together, they can identify key areas where they want to do action, and they can write grants where we give them support technically, but they then submit. And this has been done since 2010. I remember a community group that we gave support to in 2010 being the first to get monies from Australia. So there are community groups that are able to access directly climate finance for adaptation action and for mitigation action. And I know that the Green Climate Fund now has made efforts to build capacity of non-government in order to facilitate this action that must happen at the ground. And that's really key in the communities. The other group that now we are working with is the private sector. So again, by figuring out what are the enabling conditions for private sector investment and for private sector to come to the table and discuss how they see their role in promoting climate resilience and what actions they'd like to pioneer. We've been able to discuss things like grants, and I know right now we have 3 Green Climate Fund projects. I mean, Grenada has been extremely lucky. I think we're one of the few in the region that have not 1, not 2, but 3 Green Climate Fund projects active at the same time, each having funds that communities can access and that private sector can access. And I'm speaking specifically about the agricultural sector and the hotel and tourism, the tourism sector. Right. So these are some of the ways, just quickly, in which Grenada is promoting resilience and actively coming to the table and trying to create the passage and the opportunity for younger persons to be active. I know that the Caribbean Youth Environment Network has a Grenada branch, and they have caucused well. They usually have discussions somewhere around September. They have a symposium, and they prepare themselves for youth advocacy and action at the big climate change conference of party meetings. So there's a specific youth branch to the climate UNFCCC conference of party meetings, and regionally there is excellent caucus amongst the young persons, again, because this is the planet that they will be inheriting. And I want to actually highlight a quick quote. Our choices determine the extent to which today's children will live in a different, hotter world. This is a direct quote that comes from the summary for policymakers that Dr. Thomas and others have been involved in crystallizing. And it's such an important point that we really need to make sure that the choices that we are making now about how quickly we want to get on board, how quickly we want to see transition, not just with choices for electricity that make sense for our bottom line, but also are environmentally friendly and reduce the kind of social impacts that we are now seeing, where the most vulnerable are being impacted disproportionately higher than others. But also for things like our transport sector, where the government has specific subsidies in place for electric vehicles to try to balance off the costs and the capacity building for TAMCC and other persons who are young persons who are interested in maintenance of electric vehicles. So there are green jobs and opportunities that are now emerging in those sectors. And Grenada is at the table discussing with CARICOM, and through that caucusing as a bloc internationally through negotiations for these enabling environments to be made so that we can improve our chances for survival and contributing not just to the mitigation action, but to adaptation.
Thank you very much. And, you know, it's amazing how time goes by quickly. But, Dr. Thomas, I have one other question I would like to ask you. The issue of financing came up, all right? And so in considering strategic investments, for example, the World Bank and other organizations who deal with funding, we know that they rely heavily on, you know, synthesis reports that bring together, you know, information on health and climate change. The IPCC reports, are they considered by these financial organizations in planning their strategic investments?
Yes, they definitely look to the IPCC for information on, you know, what financing needs may be coming up. And one of the key findings that I was so happy we were able to include in this report is on finance and the fact that developing countries require external funding, particularly to meet our adaptation needs. We were able to get in there that we need increased financing for climate action. 3 to 6 times the current climate investment is what's actually needed in order to adapt to climate change. And another thing that we were able to highlight was that those who have contributed the least to climate change are often the most vulnerable to its impacts. And that's particularly relevant for small islands like Grenada. You know, we contribute less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change, but yet we are the ones that are experiencing the impacts. And so we critically need that external finance in order to help us to adapt to the impacts that we're facing.
Thank you very much. That's all the time we have, ladies. It's a pity, you know, I have loads of questions in my computer in front I would like to ask you, but, you know, that's all the time we have. But of course, I do look forward to having you back because that's a conversation that needs to continue. Climate change is real, so we need to continue. So, folks, that's all the time we have. But just before we close, I would like to give the ladies a quick minute just to make their parting words. Mrs. St. Louis, we start with you.
So I think that I'll just stick to the quote that was made. I mean, the recent assessment report clearly indicates that we're not yet in line with what the science has said needs to happen. And our choices as individual Grenadians, Bahamians, Barbadians, St. Lucians determine the extent to which today's children will live in a different, hotter world. So we need to step up. We need to play our role.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Dr. Thomas, your parting words?
Yeah, thanks for that, Mrs. St. Louis. I have a 5-month-old son, so the children, yes, is definitely resonating with me. And I just encourage all young people to get involved in climate change, in the science, in the policy making, in education, and activism. It is your worlds that you are inheriting, and it's critical for the youth to be engaged, particularly youth from the small islands. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas and Mrs. St. Louis. It was such a pleasure chatting with you. And of course, as I said, I look forward to having you back on the program. I just want to close the way I started, saying the synthesis report underscores the urgency of taking more ambitious action and shows that if we act now, we can still secure a livable, sustainable future for all. Thank you very much. Do have a good night. Join us next week for another episode of Our Climate Reality. All the best.